For those of you who haven't encountered Ayana, you probably have in ways you don't know. I just learned today she did a takeover of the Apple Watches on Earth Day.
So if you had an Apple Watch, I was like, "Hi, do you want to go for a walk with me?" And it like freaked out everyone who knew me. It's very, very creepy.
That was fun, but
I now know what all my friends' wrists look like and how hairy various arms are because of all of this.
Because of the pictures you got. But Ayana is an incredible marine scientist. I shudder to put titles on you because you're a marine scientist, but you're a policy guru, and you're an really incredible, talented storyteller. But I want to take us back a little bit to before you were Dr. Ayana Elizabeth Johnson. You were a kid growing up in Brooklyn, right? Mm-hmm. You were an urban kid. But from what I understand, you had a transformative experience with the sea urchin. Is that true?
This is true. And it wasn't because I stepped on one. Those are also transformative. If anyone's done that, you have to like soak your foot in boiling water / vinegar, and it's like terrible. And the spines will like be in your body for months, if not forever. So not that story, but I grew up in Brooklyn. It was actually really interesting to be following Stanley Robinson because Nelson. I grew up in Fort Greene, Brooklyn, which I now feel like I have to refer to as Old Fort Greene, because it was a completely different neighborhood. It was a mostly black neighborhood. It was a working class neighborhood. I mean, the brownstones were still gorgeous, but they were like $40,000, not $4 million. And, we had lots of parks. My parents were on the like neighborhood committee that, worked on greening up Kyler Gore Park, which is, a major intersection there. I learned to ride my bike in Fort Greene Park, which is what I talked about on that Apple Fitness episode, just the importance of green spaces in urban areas. But what you're referring to is that when I was 5, my parents were like, it's time for our daughter to learn how to swim. And we went on our only family vacation that wasn't to visit other family members, and that was to go to Key West. And I learned to swim, and I learned to snorkel, and I rode a glass bottom boat, and I saw a coral reef for the first time, and I was basically like the 5-year-old version of like, holy fuck, how come no one told me about this? Like, this is amazing. Can this be my job? And went to the Key West Aquarium, and there was a touch tank, and I learned that I was going to get to like hold ocean creatures, which seemed like a ridiculously cool opportunity. And I held a sea urchin in the palm of my hand, and its hundreds of tube feet were like crawling across my palm, and I was just like, well, this is what I'm going to be when I grow up. Like, what is this job called? And so, I decided then I was going to be a marine biologist. And then, of course, the evolution of, how many of you had marine biologist as a dream job at some point in your life? Super popular dream job. So if that tells you nothing about me, that I'm really stubborn, now you know that I was like, I will see this through to completion. But I think, sort of building on other things that have been said, I had a lot of other dream jobs that were, that was when I was 5. When I was 10, I wanted to be very specifically the lawyer that got the next Martin Luther King out of jail. I was learning about the civil rights movement. I thought, like, this is a way that I could maybe be helpful to future social movements. When I was 15, I wanted to be a park ranger because, like, getting paid to walk in the forest is, like, the coolest job ever. And then as I learned more and more about the ways in which the environment was threatened, I wanted to become an environmental lawyer, and ended up doing my PhD in marine biology because I learned that you could actually combine all of those dream jobs, and that would be ocean conservation, this mix of science and policy and justice and conservation. So yeah, that's like one chapter.
It's a great chapter. And talk to me about Urban Ocean Lab, which seems to be like the synthesis of it all, right?
Yeah, so Urban Ocean Lab is a policy think tank for the future of coastal cities, and it is, I guess, the origin story of it is I had been working in philanthropy, so I have some understanding of your world. Funding ocean conservation work, a lot of it in the Caribbean. I worked in the Caribbean more often than not for about a decade. And watching hurricanes tear through the Caribbean, the island of Barbuda in particular, where I had worked for years, set up this like completely remarkable set of ocean laws, right? A third of the ocean's protected in marine reserves, protection of parrotfish and urchins that are the lawnmowers of the reef, keeping algae in check, protections for sharks, for mangroves and seagrasses as important carbon sequestering ecosystems, anchoring only in sandy areas, a shipping lane for boat traffic, like this incredibly robust ocean zoning system that was put in place by the local community and the local government, funded by Philanthropy, bringing in the scientific expertise and the mapping expertise and policy expertise that were, and like enforcement. I had to figure out how to buy like a patrol boat. Like we were really like, how can we as Philanthropy help to provide the tools that these communities need to do all this stuff? And you watch a hurricane destroy all of that. The idea is like, and I would encourage all of you to think about some version of this, like, imagine 3 circles, and the first circle is, what are you good at? So what are your skills, resources, network, like what specifically can you bring to the table? And the second circle is, what is the work that needs doing in terms of climate and justice solutions? And there are a million solutions we need to be implementing as quickly as possible. And the third circle is, what brings you joy, or satisfaction is probably a better way to put that. We're not all like skipping around every day, giggling. And for me, the heart of those 3 circles, that Venn diagram, is Urban Ocean Lab. Is, you know, as someone who was like a marine biologist by training, a policy nerd, as a kid from Brooklyn, as someone who like really relishes policy change, as like that brings me joy. Changing the rules of the game really brings me joy. I mean, that's the heart of what we do, is thinking about how we can help coastal cities have the resources they need to make informed decisions about policy that really protect coastal communities along the lines of renewable offshore energy and dealing with sea level rise, climate-driven relocation, protecting and restoring coastal ecosystems, infrastructure. No coastal city is ready for what's coming. Like, I really hate to be the one to tell you this if you don't know, but like New York City is not ready for multiple feet of sea level rise. New York City is not ready to go completely to renewable energy right now. We just do not have the policy frameworks in place. And when we think about these issues as like coastal elite, that drives me crazy, because anyone who lives in New York City knows that like this, it is not mostly rich people who live here, right? It is across the US, it is like 60% people of color who live in coastal cities. There's a higher percentage of poor people in coastal cities than the country in general, a higher percentage of renters. When we think about the policy changes that are needed to manage this transformational moment that we're in terms of a changing climate, like we really need to think about this city level of government, not just federal, as where the rubber meets the road on a lot of these decisions.
Thank you for doing that. That's incredible. So you've walked us through your science roots, how you work in policy through your think tank. But for those of you who don't know Ayana, you might not know she's quite accomplished as an author. Your first book was All We Can Save. You have an incredible podcast, How to Save a Planet. Can you talk about how you got into this? Did you wake up one morning and say, guess what, I'm going to write a book, I'm going to start a podcast? How did you get into the more storytelling, calm space? What drew you to it? Do you like it?
It's funny because National Geographic is actually a big part of that story. My old boss was on the board of National Geographic, and at the time, the largest funder in the history of the organization. And so through that relationship, I had a chance to be part of what was then the Ocean Views blog. And I blogged the work that I was doing in the Caribbean, because I think so important to storytelling is telling the process and the progress and not just declaring victory. This is, I think, something that is very new in philanthropy, especially, is just being like, let's get in the weeds and talk about the muck of creating and the challenges and like how we're overcoming them, because I feel like so much of the lessons learned are not in the neat report at the end. And I wanted to be able to tell the story of how we were doing these collaborative projects in the Caribbean. So I think I wrote like 52 blog posts on National Geographic. This was back in the day when like I literally had a password to the WordPress. No one was editing me. That doesn't exist anymore. They've deleted the entire archive, which like we can talk about later, which I don't think was a good idea. Because we lost a lot of these stories of like the process of how we were all doing conservation around the world. And so that was like my first foray into like realizing the power of storytelling, including for highlighting the work that was happening on these tiny Caribbean islands where people had no way to get their stories out. So I was interviewing elder fishermen and people in the community and sharing those on this platform. And they were so excited to have National Geographic covering what was happening on their island. Like, it's just me, like, writing this stuff. But it was really, really valuable to the community members. And so that was the first piece, but the podcast started because I ended up at a dinner party sitting next to this dude who told me that he was going to start a climate podcast. And I looked at him, middle-aged white guy, and I was like, cool, like, what do you know about climate? And he was like, oh, nothing. And I was like, okay. He's like, oh, I'm going to be like the voice of the common man, and I'm going to like be the person through whom other people will understand this. I'll just ask the questions everyone else is asking. I was like, how will you even know what questions are the right ones to ask? And so I was like, have you considered like maybe getting a co-host? I was like 2 glasses of wine into this dinner party. This is important context. We'd like, it's like a table for 16. I had left my end of the table because it was boring, and I was sitting on the arm of a chair of a friend at the other end of the table, sort of like beginning to interrogate this person to my right. And he's like, yeah, I've thought about having a co-host. I was like, cool, like maybe it could be someone who knows something about science. He was like, yes, that'd be great. And then he's like, I was like, maybe a woman. He was like, yeah. Maybe. I was like, maybe a person of color. And then I look at him and I goes, oh, maybe it's me. I'm like tipsily harassing this man who is Alex Bloomberg, the founder of Gimlet Media, not having any idea who he is. And then I was like, cool. He was like, who are you exactly? And next thing you know, we're like whiteboarding out How to Save a Planet, which became Spotify's flagship climate show until Spotify sort of like led the charge to tank the podcast business model, which we can go into later. I think there is a viable business model for it, but they did not prove that point by buying up all these like cool smaller companies and tearing them to pieces. So yeah, sorry, all of my stories are like really long and rambly today, but I have great editors in my life.
Right now. Okay. No. And we were gonna break some news here to talk about your new book, but the little publication down the street beat us to it. Those of you saw the interview with Ayana in the New York Times about 3 days ago. It's fantastic if you haven't checked it out. Beautiful. But you have a new book coming out in September, right? Is that a galley? And it's called... This isn't a vision test, so we'll tell you what it's called. It's called What If We Get It Right? And you say in the introduction, it really moved me, and it's such a simple statement of like, the book's an invitation to imagine. And you also talk really, I think beautifully, about how the media, and I'll include myself in that, the media has drawn really, really powerful visuals around what climate change, apocalyptic, doomsday scenarios will look like. We can close our eyes and think about what that looks like. And you kind of, like in a very polite, nice way, take us to task about we haven't really drawn the visuals about what it would look like if we got it right. And now this is me talking, like, we're primates. We have big eye sockets. We might be the only species that we know of that can actually visualize and imagine. And you're asking us to imagine in this book. So I want you to talk a little bit about that. I mean, I obviously am keen on the visuals, but what's that like? What got you there?
I think this question, what if we get it right? This is the question I've been like holding on to for 2 years now, 3 maybe. And I actually didn't I couldn't write the book. I came up with the title and I sold the book, and I obviously didn't want to give the advance back, but like I had no idea how to meet the promise of the title. I mean, there were also bad titles along the way, like How Humans Survive Humanity, kind of like Sapiens style stuff. And I think at one point it was going to be more memoir. At one point it was more like a hip textbook. And it took me like 2 years to figure out that the answer to this question was that I have asked versions of this question to so many of the people who I know who are experts, and their answers have informed my understanding of what the future could hold. So the subtitle of the book is Visions of Climate Futures, and the heart of the book is 20 interviews with farmer, forester, the head of Earth Justice, the author of the Green New Deal, landscape architects, AI experts, community organizers, indigenous strategists, like youth climate activists, right? All these different people in finance and government, right? All these different perspectives on that are pieces to this puzzle answering this question of what if we get it right. And so I thought and these are all like friends of mine that I've known for years. And so they're sort of chatty, casual, fun conversations about how we get from where we are to this transformation that we need on climate change, and leaning into what's possible and helping to paint pictures of what's possible. I'm not at all an optimist. I'm not hopeful. People see the title and they're like, what if we get it right? Oh, great, like an optimist's view, full of hope. And I'm like, there's a question mark at the end of the title. But what if we get it as right as possible would maybe be like a more honest title, because like we'll never have a perfectly pristine planet with 8 billion people on it, but like we could have a much better version of the future than we're currently on track for.
So they only gave us 20 minutes, and they don't know us clearly because we could go for a long time. So we're not going to have questions because we're almost out of time. But we have a networking break at 3. I think you're around, right? I just volunteered you. But I want to end with one final question for you for this room of how can the philanthropic community do it better? How can we help you? How can we help organizations besides, write you a check? How can we help?
Yes, checks are welcome. I think this framework of new and old power is interesting to me because as I was listening to this previous conversation, I was thinking that actually the thing that I really try to do is bridge that gap. And I have a sort of, in a weird way, for like a Black girl from Brooklyn, a sort of old power pedigree, right? I went to Harvard University for my undergraduate. I did the PhD. I've worked, with billionaires in philanthropy. I have a ridiculous network in this sort of old power paradigm, but I very much am also in the world of like new power, communication, storytelling, community building, and all this stuff. And so I think I would say that like we need to fund the people who are building that bridge, because it's not the people in philanthropy, and oftentimes it's not even the community organizers who need all the funding they can get. But I think we are not investing in that interstitial piece as much as we need to. And I would say, like, when it comes to climate in particular, and I think I'm having a hard time editing myself on this in this discussion because we're the only people representing environment and climate in this whole agenda. And so I feel a lot of pressure to like pack it all in and be like, everything's connected to climate, no matter what your issue is, like find me afterwards and I'll tell you how, and like how we can collaborate. But I think there's this need to make climate solutions appealing. So if you can fund the media on solutions, not the problem, solutions journalism on climate. My book tour is bringing Environmental Voter Project and Lead Locally to do voter turnout for the election, because we really need to nail the journalism and the storytelling around the climate stakes of this election. I'm launching my book tour as a climate variety show because I feel like no one needs another book reading. We need like the most famous, comedians, magicians, rappers, poets, singers, like all engaged in the storytelling of this moment. So to the extent that you all can help us make climate solutions cool, that would be incredibly helpful, because what we need to do is welcome in as many people as possible to feel like there's a place for them in this work that's beyond the traditional media, generic list of, vote, protest, donate, spread the word, lower your carbon footprint, which is like, just fossil fuel PR to put the pressure on us as individuals. Literally, it's an Ogilvy PR campaign. And so I feel like that's where there's all this possibility is, make climate solutions cool and welcoming to everybody. Because there's one statistic I will share, which is in the U.S., despite 72% of Americans being concerned that climate change will harm plants, animals, and future generations, and 43% saying it has already affected them personally, a whopping 63% of Americans rarely or never talk about the topic of climate change with their friends and families. Furthermore, 11% of Americans, 37 million people, are willing to become actively engaged but have not taken any actions yet. And this is in the backdrop of the major TV news stations doing less reporting on climate. It is now 0.9% of major TV news minutes that are devoted to climate, and that is down from 1.2% 2 years ago, right? Like, we are heading in the wrong direction. So, anything you want to do to help would be much appreciated.
Well, thank you, Ayana, for giving us a sneak peek into the book and for joining us and giving us your backstory. And shameless plug, there is a whole track tomorrow on climate media that you'll get to see a repeat show of this, and with more new material from the two of us. But thank you so much.